As Tamar mentioned, today is the beginning of the month of Av, and so we're entering now this final stage leading up to the 9th of Av, which commemorates, of course, the destruction of the temples of Jerusalem and the city of Jerusalem. And so I thought it was only fitting that I devote this last talk in the series to images of Jerusalem. And I stressed images. It's mostly how the sages imagined the city of Jerusalem in the past. So we're not dealing with totally factual descriptions of the city, but rather an idyllic city, an ideal city, and what the sages felt should have been the Jerusalem of the past. Now, our talk deals with rabbinic allusions to Jerusalem, and here I should begin by saying that the name Jerusalem alone appears in rabbinic literature over 3,000 times, and references to the city far exceed that number because there are whole tractates of rabbinic literature, beginning with the Mishnah and then into the Talmud, that deal with Jerusalem-related affairs. Some of the tractates that deal with holidays, whether it's Passover, Yom Kippur, there are major chunks of material there that all relate to activity in Jerusalem, even without mentioning the city by name. The same is true of tractates of Mishnah that deal with the dimensions of the city and how the city can be enhanced. So there's really an enormous amount of material, and I had to obviously pick and choose which sources I'd like to focus on today. For the rabbis, creation begins in Jerusalem. In other words, this is where it all really begins. And if you look at the first source, the Midrash actually says, here we are, when the Holy One, blessed is He, created His world, He created it in the manner of a child born of a woman. Just as the creation of a child begins with the umbilical cord and is stretched here and there in 4 directions. In other words, Jerusalem is the navel of the world. So God began to create His world from the Even Shetia. I gave you the Hebrew version here as well. The Even Shetia is some sort of a foundation stone for this process of the creation of the world from Jerusalem. And from there, from that central foundation stone, the world was established or woven. The word Shetia, Shetiva Erev, could also mean a weaving process. Now, I am sure that some of you out there, when you read this text, are reminded of a very similar Greek legend or myth known as the Omphalos myth. In other words, the Greeks had an idea that the world was created in a very similar fashion, that there's a center to the world. For them, the Omphalos or naval center of the world was Delphi, and sure enough, they go to Delphi to receive some sort of divine input, the way Jews would have gone to Jerusalem. What is really fascinating is that in both cases, there's a foundation stone, known among the Greeks and in Delphi as the Omphalos stone. And what you're looking at here is a picture of one of them. There are many Omphalos stones in the area of Delphi, and this is one of them that appears in the Delphi Museum. So we have this similarity, and the idea then is that the world is created from the center, and we'll see why this is important already by going to the next source. If you look at source number 2, not only is Jerusalem the center of the world, but it is also the highest point in the world. Then you shall arise and ascend, and so the rabbis are playing with the word ascend, v'kamta ve'alita, to the place that the Lord your God will choose. This declares that the land of Israel is higher than all other lands, and the temple is higher than all of the land of Israel. Now, we know that this is not true in terms of the topography of the city. Jerusalem is not the highest point, and first of all, the Temple Mount is not always the highest point. Jaffa Gate is some 40 meters higher than the Temple Mount, and certainly Jerusalem is not the highest part of the land of Israel. But what is the point here? By claiming that Jerusalem is the highest location, what you're saying is it is the closest location to the heavenly presence, meaning God. So this would be the ideal place to interact with God. You're in the center opposite God. You're as high as you can get. And this is what scholars of religion will later on refer to as the axis mundi. In other words, this is really the axis that connects our world with the world above. Later on today, we'll find that the rabbis will take this a step further and talk about two Jerusalems. There is an earthly Jerusalem, this is our city, and there's a heavenly Jerusalem. And the question is, what is the relationship between these two? But once we accept that Jerusalem is the closest place, as it were, to the divinity, then it's obvious that it would be the ideal place to pray, because your word gets to God sooner than if you were to pray from anything else, from anywhere else. And so my first question would be, who was the first to pray in Jerusalem? And the answer is kind of startling. The first to pray in Jerusalem was God himself. If you look at source number 3 in front of you, Rabbi Berechia taught, here we are, and his tabernacle was in Shalem and his abode in Zion. At the beginning, and now we are told a primordial existence for Jerusalem. At the very beginning of the creation of the world, God erected a tabernacle in Jerusalem as if to pray in it. So here's God. Now, of course, this always struck me, that phrase, God is going to pray. Questions are obvious. Whom does God pray to? What does he say in a prayer? May it be my will that. In other words, it's striking that we find God praying. But what is his prayer? As if to pray in it. And what does he say? May it be the will. It can't be my will, because then you could do it. May it be the will that my sons perform my wishes, so that I do not destroy my house and my sanctuary. So God has a very specific prayer to utter in the most obvious place in Jerusalem, because he's praying about his house and his sanctuary. And here something striking happens. God prays that he need not destroy his house and his sanctuary. But if we scroll down to source number 17, we read a startling, almost response to that story. Here we are. The story is told that one of the rabbis in the post-temple period, after the destruction of Jerusalem, Rabbi Yossi says, I was once traveling on the road, I entered one of the ruins of Jerusalem, so Jerusalem has already been destroyed, but he wants to pray, and he encounters Elijah there. Elijah, the prophet, appears in rabbinic literature. There are some rabbis that have the good fortune of meeting Elijah, and we can never figure out who was blessed with that and who wasn't. Nevertheless, Elijah appears. He waited for me until I finished my prayer. And then he asks me, my son, what sound did you hear in this room? And listen to what the rabbi responds. I heard a divine voice cooing like a dove and saying, woe to the children, on account of whose sins I destroyed my house and burnt my temple and exiled them. Think about this for a moment. The prayer that God uttered wasn't answered. And if you put these two sources together, the message almost seems to be, you should pray, but no, not all prayers are answered, even if the prayer was issued by the highest authority of all, meaning by God himself. So there's a fascinating message here, I think, if we look at these two sources together. But let's go back and see what else takes place in the earliest days of creation. If we go back to source number 4, we read that not only was creation worked out in Jerusalem, but the creation of the first man, of Adam, also takes place in Jerusalem. Rabbi Yehuda ben Kazi said, the Holy One, blessed is he, took a handful of earth, of course, Adamah, from the place of the altar and created Adam with it. He said, would that he be created from the site of the altar and thereby survive. So it is written, and the Lord God created Adam, dust from the earth, afar min ha'adamah, and it is written, an altar of earth, mizbach adamah, you shall make for me. So adamah there means altar, adamah here means altar. Adam was created from, again, it's on the axis Monday, right? He was created from the place of the altar. Later on, of course, this will be this idea that Adam is under the altar will be embraced by Christians as well. This idea that the crucifixion takes place at the holiest spot, and the blood actually pours down from the cross into what was once the altar, and there it encounters Adam, who was buried in the same place where he was created. So we have Adam here, but Adam wasn't just created at the place of the altar. What we're going to hear is that all the greats of the very ancient world, meaning Adam, Noah, Abraham, and others, all established altars in Jerusalem on that very same site. In other words, they don't talk about praying in Jerusalem as God did, as we saw, but rather as offering up sacrifices to God. So, for instance, in source number 5, Noah, after he leaves the ark, builds an altar to God, and Elazar ben Yaakov says, where did Noah establish his altar? On the great altar in Jerusalem, where Adam sacrificed and offered as well. If we go to source number 6, we'll find that Abraham, when Abraham wants to offer up his son Isaac on the altar, he knows exactly where to go, because he comes to Jerusalem and found the same altar, right? And the rabbi stressed, he built the altar, HaMizbeach, the noted altar. That was the sign that he had. He found the ancient altar from the time of Adam, and he established the altar for the sacrifice of Isaac there as well. Now you might ask, what sacrifices did Adam offer? The rabbis know exactly. One of the sacrifices he offered was the Passover sacrifice, which of course is startling because Passover hasn't happened yet. I mean, the Israelites don't exist yet. They certainly haven't gone down to Egypt, and they certainly haven't lived through an exodus from Egypt. But this, of course, is very typical of what the rabbis did with Adam. Adam evolves in rabbinic literature from being the first human being to slowly becoming the first Jew. According to the rabbis, Adam spoke Hebrew. He actually wrote one of the Psalms, right? And of course, he wrote it one day after his own creation. He was created on Friday, right? What comes next? Shabbat. And so Adam Adam prays Mizmor Shir Liyom HaShabbat, the prayer, right, that comes to designate the Sabbath. So Adam offered a Passover sacrifice, and whenever I get to that source, I'm always struck not so much by Adam offering up a Passover sacrifice, but I tend to think about Eve. What was she doing? Cleaning the Garden of Eden for Passover or something like that. What was left to clean in the garden? Polishing apples or something like that. What is interesting is if we look at source number 7, the very first reference to prayer in Jerusalem, not sacrifice, takes us to Isaac and Rebekah. Rabbi Judah says, Rebekah, you will remember, was barren. The rabbis add a date, or rather a period for this situation. Rebekah was barren for 20 years. And after 20 years, Isaac took Rebekah. When apparently everything else failed, he takes Rebekah to the place where he was bound for sacrifice and prayed for her pregnancy, and God acceded to the prayer. So here we have now the completion of a circle where different people came to the altar in Jerusalem, one of them being Isaac, but Isaac uses it as a place for prayer. Now, I gave you this just as examples of this very early, I almost call it prehistoric Jerusalem that the rabbis created. In other words, they wanted to imagine Jerusalem as being not just sacred, but unique, special, something removed from the rest of the surrounding world, and chose these examples. But there's a second stage to the rabbinic image of Jerusalem, and that's what I call the, with or without quotation marks, historical Jerusalem. And again, when I say historical Jerusalem, because I have the highest respect for the sages, I think they had internal or some sort of unique meaning to some of the phrases that they use in describing Jerusalem. For instance, if we look at source number 8, I think no one could take this to face value. You have to sit with a computer to figure out numbers here. Rabbi Shmuel taught there were 24 main roads in Jerusalem. Each road had 24 passages. Each passage had 24 markets. Each market had 24 streets. Each street had 24 courtyards. Now, if you times 24 by 24 by 24 and so on, you're already in the millions. And then, to make things even worse, of the 24 courtyards, each courtyard would discharge twice the number of the exiles from Egypt. In other words, 1,200,000 from each of the 24 courtyards. The rabbis weren't that simple-minded. And we're going to see later on that they imagine a Jerusalem that can expand to no end, a Jerusalem that can contain all of humanity, that there's a place in Jerusalem for all of humanity, and they do this by these exaggerated numbers. We'll see in a minute that the rabbis indeed believed that masses will wind up in Jerusalem far more than anyone can imagine. In fact, if you look at source number 9, this is a well-known statement that appears in the Mishnah, in Tractate Avot, that it was so crowded, and we just saw the numbers, that this was one of the miracles that was performed for our forefathers in the temple, that no man ever said to his fellow, it is too cramped for me to lodge in Jerusalem. There was always enough room. And a number of people have already noted this source, that this is one of the miracles, not that there was room for everyone. The true miracle, of course, was that nobody ever complained. That's a miracle. But the rabbis didn't just imagine a historical Jerusalem. What they did is they imposed on the city of Jerusalem an idyllic reality. That is to say, they wanted to believe that Jerusalem personifies everything that would have been perfect in a Jewish society. But what Jewish society? This is the point. Look at source number 10 here, and we begin to understand where the rabbis are headed. Rabbi Pinchas, in the name of Rabbi Hoshaya, said, there were 480 synagogues in Jerusalem. In other words, they're talking about Second Temple Jerusalem. We know of very few. We actually found what apparently is the cornerstone of one of the synagogues in Jerusalem near Rechat HaShiloach in the Siloam pool, near the Siloam pool, that actually refers to, it's a Greek inscription that talks about a synagogue. 480 is a very large number. But beyond that, look, what I'm interested in is the next sentence. Each one of those synagogues, each one maintained a Beit Sefer and Beit Talmud. Beit Sefer, an elementary school for learning Bible, and a Beit Talmud, an advanced school for Mishnah. Now, obviously, the Mishnah was not yet redacted during the Second Temple period, but one could you could say, well, maybe it means oral tradition. But it's more than that. This source wants to imagine a rabbinic Jerusalem, because these two elements were, you must have a school, and beginning with an elementary school, the phrase is Tino Kochel Beit Rabban, or something like that, and then a Beit Talmud where you learn advanced, oral tradition. This is very rabbinic. And so what the rabbi here is saying is that already at the earliest time, Jerusalem has this image of a rabbinic community. Once it has that image, we hear about the behavior of the people of Jerusalem. Let's go down to source number 11, right? And again, Elazar ben Sadok lived at the very end of the Second Temple period, and so he seems to be testifying, or he's just after the destruction. He seems to have knowledge, but look at what he notes as the practices of the people of Jerusalem. This was the practice of the associations, chaburot. These were people who gathered together to perform mitzvot. These are what the activities of the chaburot in Jerusalem. Some would go to the house of the banquet, some to the house of mourning, some to the feast of betrothal, some to the feast of a wedding, some to the celebration of a week to the birth of a son, meaning a circumcision, and some for the gathering of bones of the deceased. Their custom was, after the body had decomposed, they would gather the bones, put it maybe in an ossuary, and then bury it again in a cave. Now, you notice what's missing here in this list. There's no temple. So we're told that this is what the associations did, but there's no reference here to priests. There's no reference here to the temple, right? This is a communal activity, or a list of communal activities by chaburot, by groups that were devoted to performing mitzvot. And as we go into these sources, we realize that for the rabbis, the ideal of Jerusalem was the perfect rabbinic community. Look at source number 12, and we get the same image. Rabbi Elazar ben Sadok said, this was the practice of the people of Jerusalem. One would enter the synagogue with his lulav in hand. So you have people walking around Jerusalem with their lulavim. One would rise to recite the Targum or pass before the ark. Again, synagogue reality, with his lulav in hand. When one rose to read in the Torah or raise his hands to bless the congregation, he would put the lulav down on the ground. He would leave the synagogue, his lulav in hand again. He would enter the house of the sick, or again, so these are, you're performing mitzvot here, or to comfort mourners, his lulav in hand. He would enter the Beit Midrash, and this is probably the obvious giveaway. In other words, here, he would give his lulav to his son or messenger, because here is where he's going to stay. He remains in the Beit Midrash, and his messenger or son takes the lulav home. When you note the Beit Midrash as his final place, right, where he actually sets up his presence, then you realize, yes, this is supposedly taking place in Jerusalem, but there's no mention of a temple here. It doesn't say, and then he walked up with his lulav to Jerusalem or to the Temple Mount. So this, I find, it's very typical of rabbinic images of Jerusalem. They are, in a sense, rabbinizing Jerusalem. In other words, Jerusalem should be a proper rabbinic community. And this, of course, is very typical of what we all do. We all imagine the past using allusions to the present. We use the present as a means of understanding the past. By the way, this is true in art. If we imagine, if we check about, let's go to Christian art, almost all the paintings of the crucifix or of the birth of Jesus, if you look around, all of the Roman soldiers are dressed like Italian grandees or Spanish grandees, depending on where the medieval painting was produced. In other words, we all imagine the past using what is familiar to us from the present. But here I think the rabbis went a step further. They wanted Jerusalem to be a proper Jewish, proper rabbinic community, and went to great lengths to do this. Jerusalem becomes an idyllic system. Look at source number 13 here. There was a claimant stone, Eben Toan, in Jerusalem. Anyone who lost something would turn there. And anyone who found a lost article would turn there. So there's a lost and found office in Jerusalem. One would stand and declare, the other would stand and supply identifying marks and retrieve it, meaning retrieve that lost object. In other words, things aren't haphazard in the city of Jerusalem. Everything is organized. And if you lose something, there's a good chance you'll find it because there's a proper system that maintains this, right? The rabbi sometimes, I chose two sources here that are really very, very, very specific, and they don't talk about any brilliant or pious behavior, but rather of customs in Jerusalem. For instance, source number 14, this was a noteworthy custom in Jerusalem. They would spread out a cloth on the doorway of a house, and as long as the cloth was spread, guests might enter. When it was removed, guests were not allowed to enter. In other words, yes, I'm opening up my house. Again, certainly the ideal is very reminiscent of the Passover Seder. Anyone who is hungry, let them come, right? So here, the owner of the house actually informs the needy, you can still enter, there's still room. And by the way, there was another, I just brought this in because our generation is into this issue of chefs and restaurants and so on. And there was another custom in Jerusalem. They would cede preparation of the meal to a chef. If something went wrong at the meal, they punished the chef. And everything, the punishment fit the degree of honor that was due the guests and honor that was due the host. But if we go to the next source, we see something even more interesting. Again, these are images of a past Jerusalem. One wonders what here was factual. But I suspect that source number 15 has some sort of history behind it. The precious sons of Zion. Why were they precious? For no one would go to a banquet until he was called and invited once again. I don't know if this conjures up with you, but it does with me, a very famous story. Why was the city destroyed according to the Babylonian Talmud? Because of the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. The wrong person shows up at a banquet. He wasn't invited. Somebody else was supposed to have been invited. The wrong person shows up. He is told forthwith to leave. He's offended. And this begins a process that winds up with the Roman army appearing in Jerusalem and ultimately destroying the city. And so what they're telling me is that originally one would not go to a banquet until he knew that he was invited, right? Or he would only go to a banquet when he knew with whom he would be eating. And then my favorite one is the following. When one of them would make a banquet, he would draw all the components of the meal on a banner. So there would be a menu, right, hanging on the door so that before you enter to partake of the meal, you should know what they're feeding you there. Why was this banner there? Because of those with delicate constitution, so that one might not eat something that would disagree with him, that would cause him distress. In other words, they thought of everything. This, again, is the perfect and ideal community where people are welcome to attend other people's banquets and are constantly being invited. And now comes an interesting source. So what we've seen is, as I said before, there's a sort of a rabbinization process of ancient Jerusalem in the eyes of the rabbi. But look at source number 16. Rabbi Abbas said, why was Jerusalem destroyed? And look at the reasons he gives. Jerusalem was destroyed only because the reading of Shema morning and evening was neglected. In other words, people did not pray properly. It doesn't say because they weren't careful about offering up sacrifices, but because their prayer somehow wasn't proper. Rav Hamnuna said Jerusalem was destroyed only because they neglected the education of school children. Again, the school system. Even according to the rabbis, it appears at a very, very late stage of the Second Temple period, a fellow by the name of Yehoshua ben Gamla. But again, look at the two factors. And now, if you had any doubts, the third statement makes it more than obvious. Rabbi Yehuda said Jerusalem was destroyed only because scholars were despised therein. Bishvil shebizuba talmidei chachamim. So what you have here is something very interesting. You have a de-rabbinization of a rabbinized Jerusalem. In other words, originally they imagined Jerusalem as being the perfect rabbinic community, and then if it was destroyed, then you go through the second stage, the de-rabbinization. They did not behave as a proper rabbinic community should behave. So there's a whole different aspect to the image of Jerusalem beyond just being of course, not just, beyond being a temple and the site of the sacrificial worship and all that is contained in that process. We saw source number 17 we read before, but I want to make this point again. Not just that he heard a voice coming out of the ruins. Rabbi Yossi says, I was once traveling on the road and entered one of the ruins of Jerusalem. And very briefly, the rabbis tell us that there is pilgrimage to the city of Jerusalem even after its destruction. We encounter rabbis, some of them come to Mount Scopus, some of them enter the city. Famous story of Rabbi Akiva, who sees the city together with his colleagues. They start to cry, he starts to laugh, and they get into a discussion. But there was a constant pilgrimage. And not only that, but ultimately we hear that there was a small community known in the sources as Kihila Kadisha Yerushalem, the holy community of Jerusalem, a very small, closely knit group of Jews that remained in the city even after the destruction, and we encounter them even after the Bar Kokhba War, right? But the fact that there was pilgrimage explains source number 18. It tells one how one should behave upon seeing Jerusalem in its state of ruin. So that on seeing Jerusalem in its state of ruin, one recites, our holy and our beautiful house, where our fathers praised thee, is burned with fire, and all our pleasant things are laid waste. And then one rends his garment. And they tell us when this takes place. As soon as he reaches Scopus, right? Scopus is that whole mountain range from Scopus and then on to the Mount of Olives, overlooking the Temple Mount, so that as soon as he reaches Scopus, he rends his clothing. And so we're told that there's actually a system of visiting the city of Jerusalem in its state of ruin. If we continue, let's go to the next source, please. Yes, here we are. The rabbis, of course, talk not only about past Jerusalem, but about a future Jerusalem as well. What can we expect from a Jerusalem that will ultimately be rebuilt? And here again, the vast numbers, but it's more than numbers. Who shall come to Jerusalem? Rabbi Hoshaya, and it is striking that we're reading now from a midrash of the land of Israel, Psikta de Rav Kahana, which was produced in Byzantine Israel. We don't know where exactly it was edited, but it was produced in the Byzantine period. And so Christians already ruled the land of Israel. And look at what the rabbis have to say. Rabbi Hoshaya in the name of Rabbi Abbas. In the future, Jerusalem will become a lantern to the nations of the world. And they will proceed to its light, for it is written, and the nations shall go by your light. Right? And so Jerusalem, that we're told, will attract Gentiles. Now, what is, of course, fascinating is, it was attracting. Beginning in the 4th century, Christians were coming to Jerusalem. And not only that, very quickly, they begin to identify sites where ultimately they built churches. We know this, Helena shows up in Jerusalem and identifies all sorts of sites. And so what the rabbis are saying, yes, these Gentiles will come to Jerusalem, but not for the purpose that they're coming today, as we will see, but for another purpose. And source number 20 follows this line, right? Rabbi Yochanan, in the future, God will make Jerusalem a metropolis for all the lands. Metropolis is a Greek word, metropolis, a mother city. In other words, yes, there are lands, there are colonies, but the center is the metropolis, and that's Jerusalem, as it is written, Ashdod and its daughters. Every mother has daughters. So just as a mother or a city has daughters, like the city of Ashdod, Jerusalem will have daughters because it will be the metropolis. But not only will non-Jews flock to Jerusalem, the exiled of Israel will also flock to Jerusalem. And it becomes inherently linked with the belief that Jerusalem will ultimately be restored and rebuilt. The rebuilding of Jerusalem and the gathering of exiles are two conditions, right, upon which the ultimate restoration will be based. So Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani said, there is an Aggadic tradition that Jerusalem will not be built until the exiled are gathered. And if someone should tell you that the exiled have been gathered, but the city of Jerusalem is yet to be built, don't believe it. This cannot happen. For it is written, right? The builder of Jerusalem in scripture, in Psalm, okay? Bonei Yerushalayim, Nitchei Yisrael Yechanes. The builder of Jerusalem is mentioned first in the scripture, and afterwards he will gather the exiles of Israel. And so you have now a city that, now remember, when the rabbis imagined the ancient, or rather Second Temple Jerusalem, they imagined it as a city that could contain millions of people. Now again, the same problem arises. If all of the Gentiles flock to Jerusalem and all of the exiles of Israel flock to Jerusalem, how will the city contain them? And so source number 2 immediately addresses this question. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said to Rabbi Elazar HaModai, but can Jerusalem contain all these? He replied, yes. In the future, God will tell Jerusalem, extend thyself, enlarge thyself, receive thy hosts. In other words, God will have to restore Jerusalem or create an enormous city that can contain all of those people that are flocking to the city, whether they are Jews or non-Jews. And now we come to one of the most fascinating ideas regarding the rabbinic image of Jerusalem. And we'll see in a moment that the image itself was also known to Christians, but let's read the rabbinic source first. It deals with the idea that above and opposite our Jerusalem, there is a celestial city, right? Heavenly Jerusalem, Yerushalayim Shel Mala, the Jerusalem of above. So there are two Jerusalems. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, source number 23, said, the Holy One, I will not enter heavenly Jerusalem until I enter earthly Jerusalem. Now this is interesting. In other words, heavenly Jerusalem apparently is the celestial city where God himself resides. This is his city. But it's opposite earthly Jerusalem, and apparently God is outside of his own city, and he tells us he will only enter his own heavenly Jerusalem under certain conditions, right? I will not enter heavenly Jerusalem until I enter earthly. In other words, earthly comes first. Now the Midrash asks, is there a heavenly Jerusalem? How do you even know that there's a heavenly Jerusalem that exists? Yes, as it says, Yerushalayim habluya ke'ir shechubra la yachdav. Jerusalem built up is like a city. I use one of the translations, knit together, and that's why I brought the Hebrew, chubra, to connect, right? It is like a city that is connected together, right? In other words, there are two Jerusalems. Rabbi Joshua ben Levi gives us another explanation, which doesn't deal with heavenly Jerusalem, but I want to quote it because it's a quotation that we all recognize and are not always aware of its origin. Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi says it means a city which makes all of Israel chaverim. This is a play on the word chubra la yachdav. It makes all of Israel chaverim. And here, this warrants an explanation. Chaver in modern Hebrew means friend. And so we always assume that Jerusalem renders all of Israel friends. I wish that were the truth. I wish that were the case. Let's pray for that. But actually, the original meaning of this sentence is different. The rabbis use the word chaver to distinguish between chaver and am haaretz. Am haaretz is not just an ignorant person. Am haaretz is a person who is not particular about the laws of purity, in particular the laws of purity and the laws of tithing, of giving off a portion of the agricultural produce to the priest, to the Levite. And so the chaver is very particular about purity, whereas the am haaretz is just the opposite. He is suspect. The am haaretz is suspect to have somehow assumed some impurity. Now, if you're impure, what does that mean regarding your relationship with the city of Jerusalem? Can you enter Jerusalem impure? And even if you can enter Jerusalem impure, can you enter the Temple Mount in a state of impurity? And here, Rabbi Joshua ben Levi says something very interesting. During the pilgrimage, it's as if there were no Amei Ha'aretz. In other words, can I say we look the other way, or we disregard the ritual impurity of some of the masses? In other words, the city itself has the power to render all of those inside as Chaverim. For the purpose of entering the Temple Mount, we are all Chaverim on the days of the festival. But if we go back to that source, I want to again talk about this issue of heavenly Jerusalem. The church also knows about a heavenly Jerusalem. The heavenly Jerusalem, for some authors of the church, was a spiritualized Jerusalem. And the spiritual Jerusalem, in a sense, is intended to, if not usurp, I won't use that phrase, but to supersede the physical, earthly Jerusalem. Very, very similar to spiritual Israel as distinct from Israel of the flesh, that will now be, right, superseded by a spiritualized Israel. And so the earthly Jerusalem opposite a heavenly spiritual Jerusalem fits very nicely with the Christian distinction between spiritual Israel or spiritualized Israel and a Israel of the flesh. And then, of course, the question is, so which has priority? Which of the two Jerusalems has priority? Clearly, among some authors of the church, it was heavenly Jerusalem. But now look at source number 24. Jerusalem is directly above, opposite earthly Jerusalem. It was because of the great love God has for earthly Jerusalem that he created another in heaven. He wanted his own opposite earthly, because of his love of earthly Jerusalem. As it says, see, I have engraved you on the palm of my hands. Your walls are ever before me. And now comes the striking statement. God has sworn that his presence will not enter heavenly Jerusalem. Right? In other words, he removes himself from his own celestial Jerusalem until earthly Jerusalem is rebuilt. In other words, his first priority is to rebuild earthly Jerusalem, which of course counters to what I described as being the image that the church developed. In fact, it's more than that. For the church, it was very important that earthly Jerusalem either not be rebuilt or not be rebuilt and given over or back to Israel. If you look at Athanasius, Athanasius was a bishop from Alexandria, lived ultimately in the 4th century, very, very important early church theologian. If the Jews had maintained their institutions, they could deny the coming of the Messiah. But now all is decided, everything. Prophecy, their holy city, and their temple, all these have been taken forever. In other words, this is part of Christian theology, that the city of Jerusalem has been taken forever from the Jews. So that if we back scroll now, can we go just to move up a bit in the source? There we are, a little further. There we are. God has to, now look at the line here. God has sworn that his presence will not enter heavenly Jerusalem until earthly Jerusalem is rebuilt. In other words, the priority is earthly Jerusalem. And what does this prove? How beloved art Israel before the Holy One, blessed is he. In other words, by God declaring that earthly Jerusalem has a priority, he's basically, or we learn from this, that Israel, and I'll add the word, are still beloved before the Holy One, blessed is he. In other words, earthly Jerusalem has a critical role to play even in the ultimate restoration or re-entering of God into heavenly Jerusalem. This issue, if we scroll a little further down, the issue that earthly Jerusalem should not be restored to Israel. This was a critical part of church theology. So much so that when in the middle of the 4th century, Julian, the Roman emperor, commonly referred to as Julian the Apostate, because he opposed Christianity, he is a believing pagan, and his one way of pulling the rug out from underneath Christian theology is to restore Jerusalem to Jews. In other words, he knew very well, he was brought up, by the way, in a very strict Christian environment, And see, he knew that restoring Jerusalem to Israel is a critical, I would say, response to Christian theology. And so he writes a letter to the Jews asking that they pray for him. He's about to embark on a war against the Persians. And he says, this you should do so that when I successfully complete my campaign with the Persians, I will be able to rebuild with my own funds the holy city of Jerusalem that you, Israel, have waited so many years to settle, and there I will praise together with you the Most High God. Let's go scroll down. I'd like to make one other point about Jerusalem. For the rabbis, Jerusalem had a unique legal status. It does not belong, the city does not belong to its residents. It belongs to greater Israel. It is sort of above the tribal division of the land of Israel into the various tribal portions. I used to compare this to Washington, D.C. In other words, a city that doesn't belong to any given state, but to all of the American population. However, I'm told very, very recently that now there's actually a movement that wants to turn Washington, D.C. into a state as well. Nevertheless, because Jerusalem doesn't, it's not just Jerusalem, the ground that doesn't belong to its residents. Nobody can own property in Jerusalem. And as a result, since yes, you can live in a house, but the house doesn't really belong to you 100%. And so houses are not rented in Jerusalem because they are the property of all the tribes. In other words, Jerusalem is a national property rather than a local one. Rabbi Abbas and Rabbi Shimon says, nor do they rent beds. The hotel industry in Jerusalem would have collapsed if they were told, if I were to tell them, you're not allowed to ask for a night's rent of a room. You're not allowed to rent beds in the city. This, of course, created a tremendous, if this indeed were the case, how thousands, tens of thousands of pilgrims come to the city of Jerusalem during pilgrimage. And so the source tells us something very unique that, and we'll skip over I'll just read the first line. The hides of the sacrificial beasts were also not for sale. They would give these hides, right, the residue of sacrificial worship would be given to innkeepers as an inducement. So yes, we can't pay them rent, but you know what, if you take these hides for your own and kind of stay outdoors during the holiday and let the visitors enter indoors, that would be very nice. And so we're told that guests would buy woolly sheep hides that were worth 4 or 5 selah, meaning that they were quite valuable, and these were left as compensation for the men of Jerusalem. They were very careful not to render Jerusalem an uncomfortable environment. No dunghills are made there. No kilns are made there. Even gardens and orchards should not be cultivated on account of the bad odor. And certainly no fowls and no dead persons are kept there overnight. If we look further down, one more source, the upkeep of the city of Jerusalem does not come from taxes that the locals had to pay. It comes from the shkalim that were sent to Jerusalem from all over the Jewish world. They were sent, and these shkalim were brought to the Temple Mount. They were used, obviously, for sacrificial worship, but there was a remainder. There remained significant funds in the treasury of the temple. And we're told that the upkeep of the water channel, meaning all of the aqueduct that brought water to Jerusalem, the city walls, the towers thereof, and all of the city's needs were provided from residue of the shekel chamber. In other words, the city itself was maintained by funds from Jews all over the world. And I always imagine the pilgrim coming from abroad in the Second Temple period, and probably, I'd like to see what they've been doing with my shekel in this city. And, quite frankly, he probably thought it went for the Upkeep sacrifice, his shekel, and it could have gone for the sewage system of Jerusalem. Nobody knows. And that's the point, that all of Israel were partners, as it were, in the city of Jerusalem. And very finally, if we downscroll, remembering Jerusalem. You remember Jerusalem in practice and by making various statements. So a man, source number 29, A man puts plaster on his house, leaves a small area as a memorial to Jerusalem. You prepare all that is needed for a meal, but you leave a matter out. A woman prepares all her ornaments, but leaves something aside, saying, if I forget thee, O Jerusalem. In other words, remembering Jerusalem is on a daily basis. It's not something you do on Tisha B'Av or on the 9 days or on the 3 weeks. It's something you do on a daily basis. You pray towards Jerusalem. The Mishnah, the Tosefta here in 30 talks about what does a blind man do who doesn't know the direction towards Jerusalem? He directs his heart. But everyone else prays towards the land and towards Jerusalem, so you have an effect where all of Israel are praying in one direction. And if we go to the last source here, yes, can we go down one more? Okay, we're told you remember Zion at certain times, and especially during prayer. So when does he, meaning a person, remember Jerusalem? When standing in prayer, he must remember Jerusalem and say, to Jerusalem, thy city, return in mercy. When you recite the grace, Birkat Hamazon, after meals, a person says, the Lord who comforts Zion and rebuilds Jerusalem. What is fascinating is that these prayers for Jerusalem preceded the destruction. And we encounter the writings of Ben Sira, Ecclesiasticus, who also lays down the basis for prayers for the city. It could be that part of the city had not been rebuilt since the first destruction. Ben Sira lived just prior to the Hasmonean state, and we know that the city is only going to expand subsequent to the building of the Hasmonean capital of the new state. And so Ben Sira, and I found this to be a proper conclusion to our talk today, Ben Sira says, take pity on your holy city, Jerusalem, the foundation for your throne. Fill Zion with your majesty, your temple with your glory. And then he ends off in chapter 51, almost the very end of Ben Sira. Give thanks to him who rebuilds his city, for his mercy endures forever. On that line, with that line, I think we would conclude our discussions of the 3 weeks and of Jerusalem. I know there were a few questions, and so if Ariel wants to give me at least some of the questions, we have a few minutes to address some of your questions. Yes?
Yes, first of all, thank you, Professor Gaffney, for this wonderful lecture. We really only have a few minutes, so I'll just take, 1 or 2 questions. Howard Rosen is asking, is it possible that another interpretation that the rabbis did not think the temple would be rebuilt for a 3rd time?
Would or would not be rebuilt? No, the rabbis used...
Would be rebuilt for a 3rd time.
Well, the phrase Mehirai Banei HaMikdash is a very well-known phrase in rabbinic literature. They believed it would be rebuilt. One can almost imagine that the Bar Kokhba War had some people involved that believed and Bar Kokhba struck coins to the freedom of Jerusalem and so on. And there's a certain imagery there that would suggest a rebuilding of the temple. There's maybe a holy ark there, and so on. Yes, it was definitely a common belief. The question is, how immediate was this belief? And here you find differences among the rabbis. There were those who believed it is just around the corner, and there were those who, kind of said, don't push it, right? And there are actually statements that disparage those who are pushing forward the end of days, trying to make it happen in advance, to advance the end of days, and be careful. They learned the lesson of 2 disastrous upheavals or uprisings, the uprising of 70 and the Bar Kokhba War, and tried to quiet, right, these immediate wishes for the reestablishment of Jerusalem. Another question, please.
Tova, I'm hoping I'm reading this right. She's asking, what do you have to know who you were sitting next to before answering the invitation?
Again, I think that this is, it could be connected also with the Kamtan Bar Kamta story. You're careful who you associate with. Jerusalem is not like your local town or village. One never knows who is there at any given time. And remember, we're talking about the late, I would imagine that many of the memories of the rabbis of Jerusalem harken back to the very last days of Jerusalem. And if you remember 2 lectures ago, we spoke about what was happening in Jerusalem. You want to be very careful who's sitting next to you. He might be somebody from the opposition party, and if he's a Sicarii, it means he has a little dagger under his clothing, and it would be wise to know whom you're going to have this banquet with. So that could be part of the background for something like this. Yes.
And just in terms of a meal, if we're just talking about it, Charlotte is kind of adding, she wasn't asking, but she just wrote that she asks the guests if they have any eating restrictions before she plans a meal.
Right, of course. In other words, I think there, the eating restrictions, of course, when many of us travel, it's do you have specific religious restrictions, or do you have a problem with particular foods? And I thought that this was a fascinating statement, that one should ask in advance, right? Or I thought it's better. Instead of saying, do you have any restrictions, you put the menu on this banner, right? And thereby you issue a message. This is what people will be offered. If you can't handle this food, you might want to go next door, right? And it could be so it's a much more subtle way of not having to tell a person you may not want to stay for the meal.